So what I want to talk about for the rest of this class is an empirical example that I think helps think through what some of this stuff looks like in the real world. Some of this aligned, misaligned, et cetera, looks like in the real world. And tries to think about some of these questions about kind of, is corruption mostly about giving the slots to the wrong people, or is corruption mostly about kind of greasing the wheels? Okay, and making things move faster. And that's the point of this paper. So this paper is about getting a driver's license in India. Okay, it's in Delhi. And the question I said is corruption really about greasing the wheels, or is it about creating inefficiency? So what would you mean by, what would corruption greasing the wheels mean in this context?
Perhaps the bureaucracy that controls driver's license administration in India is like really bloated and slow.
Right.
And like bribes sort of facilitate things get done more quickly.
Exactly. So right, you get your driver's license quicker. Does it mean anything else? What else? What would it mean for us to be in the kind of aligned case here?
That better drivers are more willing to pay bribes.
Right. And so corruption therefore should, right? So the key thing is, right, so better drivers are willing to pay bribes. So corruption would allow people who need them to get their license, need to get their licenses faster to get them faster, but would still preserve giving driver's licenses to people who know how to drive. So let me back up. What's the point of having a driver's license? Why do we make people have driver's licenses? Huh?
So they can drive.
Well, be more specific.
Legally.
Well, so that way you don't have people who don't know how to drive, like, getting into accidents and, like, because there's no punishment.
Exactly, right? So if you drive and you know how to drive, you not only pose a danger to yourself, you pose a danger to others. That's why the government needs to get involved, right? Because there's an externality. And and we want to have driver's licenses to make sure that only the people that know how to drive are driving, right? Exactly, that's the goal, right? Goal of driver's licenses is, and therefore, if you think about driver's licenses, like almost any kind of optimal driver's license system should give the driver's licenses to people who are better drivers than the people it denies driver's licenses to, right? So in general, if you are a better driver, you should be more likely to get a license, right? That should be a key fact about any driver's license system, because if that wasn't true, right, it would be a problem. Now I may have, at least I said that. We may come back to that. Maybe I'm wrong. We'll think about keep that in mind. You may want to amend that later. Keep that in mind. Okay, so and what would it mean if it was inefficient in this context?
Well, if you could just buy a driver's license without taking a test, then it's not going to the better drivers. It's just going to richer people who maybe don't know how to drive.
Right. Okay, so they want to see if. Okay, so be more precise though. So what do we actually need to know? So do we need to know that it's going to richer people, or what do we actually care about?
It's going to people that are worse at driving.
Right. Somehow corruption allows people who are bad drivers to become to get licenses. Now, the reason I want to amend what I just said a little bit is actually, from a societal perspective, how would you think about a driver's license system? Suppose, putting on your economist hats, how would you think of a driver's license system that said, if you know how to drive, your driver's license is $5, and if you don't know how to drive, we'll still give you a license, but it'll cost you $10,000.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it, and if I knew that I didn't know how to drive, I don't see why I put my own life at risk and go get a license anyways.
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so first of all, imagine driving as a continuum. There are better drivers and worse drivers. But in some sense, this is actually a broader debate about kind of what's the role of government in regulation. So there's a question of, suppose that some people don't know how to drive and aren't very good drivers and would still like to drive. They're willing to take the risk for themselves, right? There's one question of whether the government should protect people from themselves. Right? And so say, look, you're a bad driver. You may think you're a good driver, but you're a bad driver, so you can't drive. And I think people can disagree about that point, right? Whether you should protect people from themselves. And actually, there's been a huge debate about seatbelts, for example, whether people should have to wear seatbelts, which comes down to exactly this fundamental disagreement. So actually, in Massachusetts, I think it went back and forth a few times. Actually, first you had to wear seatbelts, and then people said, no, you don't have to wear seatbelts, and now you do. And so actually, if you go to New Hampshire, which is just say just to the north of here, their motto is "Live free or die," and if you drive in New Hampshire, it says "Welcome to New Hampshire. Seatbelt use is mandatory for people under the age of 12 and common sense for everyone else, but not mandatory." And they I think have the view that actually, you should wear seatbelts. It's like clearly a good idea to wear seatbelts, but like if you don't wear seatbelts, kind of the damage is all on yourself, and you're not really imposing damage on other people. So the government, that's your choice to do that. So it kind of whereas Massachusetts has the view that actually no, you have to wear seatbelts. So reasonable people could I think disagree on whether governments should protect people from themselves, but I think almost everyone would agree that governments should protect you from other people, right? So the seatbelt example is kind of a really interesting case because seatbelts are mostly about protecting yourself. Not knowing how to drive, we could say that's kind of the Massachusetts-New Hampshire distinction. Like if you can't drive, should the government protect you from yourself? But everyone would agree, I think, that because you impose a danger on other people who had no stake in that decision, then the government has the right to, or should probably come in and make sure you don't drive.
And just like from, again, experience, I realize that the people who buy licenses the most are the people who can't read. It's not that they don't know how to drive, they drive well. But
I'm going to have data on that. We're going to come back to that. That's a great question, and actually one of the things they do in the study is measure people's driving skills to exactly deal with these kinds of issues.
I was going to go back to the $10,000 thing.
Yes.
It could be that if that's the cost of health insurance, like you're just like taxing them on the negative externality, and then in some sense it's still efficient because they're going to crash into people, but then you can give them $10,000 and be like, it's fine.
Yeah. So actually I think this is right. So I think that there's a view that says, look, actually the key thing that we want is for people who can't drive to pay a much higher cost so that they internalize the externality, right? And maybe you just charge them a really high amount. And for a lot of people, they'll say, well, gee, faced with those differences in cost, I'm going to learn how to drive because it's a lot cheaper. But if in fact we know how much the externality is in money terms, we can just monetize it and make the transfers in money terms anyway. So I think actually it's an important point because actually it's important to keep that in mind in interpreting the results because we need to care not just about who gets the licenses in equilibrium, but how much they had to pay depending on kind of whether they could or couldn't drive.
The other thing is like why they're driving. So it could be that they're driving because they need it faster, and then it could be that the most people who need driver's licenses for their businesses and for like profits, and not because they're just bad drivers, or it could be because they're bad
Right.
drivers.
So exactly. So that's what they're going to get in the study. So here's what they're going to do. Okay, they're going to stand outside Delhi Driver's License Bureau and find people who were interested in getting a license, and they're going to randomize them into 3 groups. Say, come here, please do a survey. We're going to randomize you into 3 groups. So the bonus group, so a third of the people, are given a large financial bonus if they can get their license within 32 days. And I think that the reason for that is 31 days is the legal minimum amount of time it takes to get a license in India. So they didn't want people to have to break the law. So they said, look, the minimum number of days plus 1. You get some big bonus. Okay? A second group was called the lesson group, and they gave them free driving lessons. Okay, and then they had a control group. So if you thought that all corruption did was about greasing the wheels and had no efficiency implications, what would you predict from the bonus group?
That the good drivers in the bonus group would get the license within 32 days and the other ones wouldn't.
Exactly, right? So it should speed up the people who are good drivers, but it should not speed up the bad drivers, right? How about the lesson group? So what would you expect if so what is the lesson? So that's what the bonus group is going to tell you. What is the lesson group telling you? Why are they doing the lesson group?
So if people, they know that they're bad drivers and they're offered a chance to get free lessons and it'll make it easier for them to get the license, then they're going to self-select into that group. Whereas if you are a good driver, you wouldn't.
Okay, so it's true that you could look at self-selection, but they're actually just going to compare the experimental outcomes about being randomized into one of these 3 groups. So the question is, how does being randomly offering some people the free lessons help them?
Would get their license more quickly because they become better drivers.
Okay, right? So we think they should get their license more likely to get their license. So let's make another question though. In the bonus group, we were talking before about looking at sort of whether the good versus the bad drivers. But here they're actually using a whole experimental treatment to randomly create some good drivers. So why do they want to do that as opposed to sort of looking at who happens to be a good driver and who happens to be a bad driver?
Like there might be some systemic bias about who's a good driver and a bad driver.
Right, it might be correlated with other stuff. So maybe like the rich people are good drivers and the poor people are bad drivers on average, right? Or, you know, and if that's correlated with willing to pay bribes, actually it's telling you nothing about kind of the, you know, the ability of corruption to respond to kind of good or bad drivingness. It's actually telling you about something totally different about which is just correlated with good or bad drivingness. So the key idea of the lesson group is to generate variation in your ability to drive that's randomly assigned. And so the key question from lesson group is, you know, is this system at all still responsive to kind of the thing it's supposed to be responsive to? If we have some people that are randomly made better drivers, are they more likely to get lessons? Are more likely to get licenses? Similar to question. Yeah.
Wait, so what exactly did they do with the lesson group when they were done with the lessons? Did they then like tell them to get their license within 30 days?
No.
Or they just let them go?
They just let them go. They just let them go on their merry way and see what happens. Okay. So what happens here? And so for each group, what they're going to do is they're going to ex post measure their driving ability with driving tests. They'll find out about the bribe paying process and whether they obtain the license. Okay, and we sort of talked about this. So here are just some summary stats, just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So some of these stats are kind of amazing, right? So in general, only 50% of the people that try to get a license got one. 48%, it's pretty amazing. Only 15%, this is the control group, by the way. This is the control group. Almost nobody gets in the minimum amount of time. 15% only get in the minimum of the time. And there's some suspicion, you should already know from the control group that there are some problems with this process. So in particular, 34% of people obtained a license without taking the licensing exam. And this is my favorite one, which is 29% of people obtained the license and automatically failed the independent driving test. And what does it mean to automatically fail the driving test? It means you were so bad that the driving people did not feel safe going out in a car with you to test your driving. So this is like didn't know the gas pedal from the brake level, right? So 29% of people who didn't know the gas pedal from the brake essentially got their driver's license. Or sorry, 29%, no, it's worse than that. 29% of the total population is in the group who both got their license and failed the exam. Okay, so there's really a lot of kind of like bad driving. And those are kind of the key facts. So I'm out of time now, so I'll start at the beginning of next class with the final results on this, and then we'll move to the last corruption lecture next time.